Hello everyone. Welcome to another Joe and Cat Chats. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about the racial wealth inequalities. So, yeah, we've got a jam-packed hour. We've prepared a lot. There's a lot of history that I've sort of recently looked into to inform the discussion. So I think it's going to be great. So I'll just add Joe in. Hello. Oh my goodness. I'm gonna just add him again. See what's up. Hopefully he will join and we're doing well. Oh no. It seems like he's not able to join easily, so I don't know what's going on. Hopefully he'll be able to connect, but I am not sure. What is up with that? Hopefully we'll get him in on this and have it. Oh, hello.
Now we're talking. Now we're cooking.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Uh-oh. Seems like Joe's connection is maybe bad today. I'm not sure what is happening. Hello.
Okay. Yeah, you froze up for a second.
Yeah, so did you. I don't know what's going on.
I have no idea what's going on. You know what? I think the powers that be don't actually want us talking about all this racial stuff.
It's true.
It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. There's loads of YouTube channels being shadow banned. There's loads of censorship that's taking place. We just happen to be the next victims of this sort of internet censorship. So that means we're actually doing something quite productive. Because if the powers that be don't want us talking about important stuff like this, they wouldn't be looking for to shut us down.
Exactly. Good call.
Miss Wells, how are you?
I'm doing well. Just living life, as usual. How about yourself?
You know what? I'm the exact same answer. I'm just living life as usual. I'm going through it, and I'm managing it as best as I possibly can. So it is what it is, and that's that. If you understood anything I just said, then
Perfect.
Wow. Yeah, exactly. And Catherine, and as you so eloquently said a couple of minutes ago while I was trying to connect, it's a jam-packed hour, and we're now down to about 55 or 56 minutes because of the internet connectivity issues. But we're talking about race and wealth inequality, the racial wealth gap. Why does it exist? Why do people like you have more wealth than people like me? Why does that happen? How did it happen? Where did it come from? We're going to try to dissect all of that in the next 55, 56 minutes or so.
That sounds good to me.
It sounds amazing to me.
Let's get into it.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get into it. And for everybody that's chiming in right now that wants to participate in the discussion, please do so. If you have any questions, ask. If you want to interrupt us while one of us is in the middle of a soliloquy where we're talking about something, do it, because we do this for you. Sharing is caring, yeah. And we're here to serve.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. So yeah, we definitely appreciate comments and questions and all the things.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Absolutely.
So what's the racial wealth gap, and what's the reality of it?
The reality of it is the racial wealth gap is literally just that in those three terms. It is a gap of wealth between racial designations. So, and I think we want to make this as simple and plain and as fundamental of a discussion as we could possibly have, because so many people get wrapped up in terminology and jargon and semantics. It's like, oh, well, hey, what is the racial wealth gap? What is it? Is that some new fancy term? Well, so much of what these terms actually are is an actual deconstruction of the terminology itself. So what is race? Let's talk about that. Race is a categorization of people, distinct groups of people, based upon physical characteristics or social qualities. You belong to the white race. I belong to the black race. Okay? There are obvious differences in physical appearance, physical features, and social groupings, qualities, etc., that are part of race. I want to read a quote that it's always stuck in my mind. This is from a scholar named David Lee. He's an English professor at the University of Oregon. I want to read this to you. It's an excellent discussion of what race is. He says, race is not a thing, but a relationship. Race is biological irrelevance with fatal social consequences. I'm going to read that again, just for everybody in the back that didn't hear me.
Thank
He
you.
says, race is biological irrelevance with fatal social consequences. It is not about symbolic representation and feel-good respect. It is about equality and the exercise of rights and responsibilities and the access to political, economic, and cultural power. It is about the citizenry's ownership of democracy and its deprivatization. Race matters differently for different races. Race reinforces over time through repetition and variation the boundaries between settlers and natives, masters and slaves, citizens and aliens, and from the institutional investment in oneness to the current racial politics of the White House.
Wow.
So
That is jam-packed full of information.
That's jam-packed full of information. That's exactly
Yeah.
what we do here on the Joe and Cat Chats. We jam-pack it full of information. And what Dr. Lee said is absolutely correct. It is biological irrelevance with fatal social consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at what we talked about a couple of weeks ago with regards to Karens, it's biological irrelevance. It shouldn't matter that Central Park Amy was a white woman and Christian Cooper was a black man. It shouldn't matter. But because race matters, the title of Cornel West's legendary book, Race Matters, because race matters, and because that biological irrelevance all of a sudden becomes relevant.
Yes.
Central Park Amy almost got Christian Cooper killed. It happened with Emmett Till. Again, biological irrelevance. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about this later on, how another instance of a black person allegedly assaulting a white person created a race riot, otherwise known as Black Wall Street. We'll talk about that towards the end of the discussion. But again, biological irrelevance with fatal social consequences. So the next part of that sort of deconstruction of the terminology racial wealth gap is, what is wealth? Wealth is when you got an abundance of stuff. You've got material possessions, you've got cash, you've got resources, whether it's cash, whether it's mineral resources, real estate, whatever. Now, there's a common misconception of people confusing what is the difference between rich and wealthy. Okay, there are plenty of people that are rich. There's loads of dudes in the NBA that got lots of money. Steph Curry makes $35 million a year shooting a basketball. LeBron James makes a lot of money dribbling a basketball. Cristiano Ronaldo gets a whole lot of money per year to kick a ball around the pitch. But they're rich. They're not wealthy. They're not wealthy. Rich means you just got a whole lot of money. That's really what it is. Wealthy means you got a lot of money, but you also know how to make more of the money. So an example of rich is, okay, right now Chelsea is playing Chelsea's playing a football match right now versus Norwich City. An example of rich would be one of their strikers, Christian Pulisic. He's a striker. He makes a lot of money per year. An example of wealthy is the team owner Roman Abramovich, a Russian billionaire that's worth about 17 or 18 billion with a B dollars.
Yeah.
Rich, hey, you can buy a sports car. Wealthy, you can buy the whole damn plant.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And create more of those resources.
Exactly. Yeah. And I see wealthy as being like really hoarding of resources more than just money. It can be passed down generations. and it's based in equity. So it's
Yes,
based in long-term investment in things that are going to keep building your monetary wealth, as
correct.
well as your social wealth and cultural wealth
Cor-
and all of the other
correct.
things. So it's like a lot more all-encompassing. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why we use that term in this conversation, because the wealth gap is really, really what we're talking about. It's not,
Exactly.
yeah, it's not a conversation to be had about the several rich Black people in the world. Like that's a thing, but
It is. It is.
wealth is different.
Right. The conversation is racial wealth gap. It's not racial rich gap.
Hmm.
It's racial wealth gap. And you talked about, hey, long-term investment, long-term gains, generational. One of the aspects of one of the reasons why the racial wealth gap is so wide is lack of home ownership. And the one asset that consistently appreciates over time is real estate, land ownership. And we're going to talk about why the racial wealth, one of the major reasons why the racial wealth gap exists is Black people's inability to buy homes and secure loans to buy homes. We're going to talk about that later on. And the last word in the term racial wealth gap is racial inequality is inequality. It's like, hey, shit's different. You have more than me. You know, you've got more money than me. That's not equal. Now, we don't want to confuse equality with equity. Equality means everybody gets the same stuff and everybody gets the same access to the same stuff. So if you and I are applying to McGill University for a PhD program, I get the same equality, I get the same access as you. You got a master's degree, I got 2 master's degrees, and we want to go for PhDs in sociology. Hey, you know, we both have equality. We can apply, we can get in, we can do our thing. Now, equity is making sure that there's proportional representation for all of the people who want to apply to that program to get in, given those same opportunities. And the proportionality of those of the representation falls under class, gender, and race,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
sexual and sex. Sexual orientation obviously also plays a role into that. So if there's 100 people that apply, but there's only one Black person that gets in, that doesn't necessarily look like equity.
Hmm.
Now again, it has to be proportional. So equality and equity. The famous phrase that continually pops up is equity is about sameness. I'm sorry, equality is about sameness, equity is about fairness.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Equality is about sameness, equity is about fairness. And I'm going to bring up a quote from my long lost uncle Ansel. He told me this when I was 11 years old. He would always call me Jojo. He said, Jojo. And because my younger brother got an extra piece of candy when he came down for Halloween one year. I said, Uncle Ansel, that's not fair. That's not fair. That's not right. It's not fair. And he looked me in the eyes and he said, Jojo, fair is a place where they judge horses and pigs and you buy cotton candy. And I never forgot that. And I tell my daughter that now, and she hates when I say that to her. I told my ex-wife that too, and she hated that. It's probably one of the reasons why we got divorced. But fair is a place where you judge horses and pigs and buy cotton candy. So fair is a rather subjective sort of terminology. You kind of know it when you see it. It kind of is similar to when I mentioned that Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart a couple of weeks ago when he talked in reference to pornography. And when I said, hey, you know, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. And people say that same sort of thing about racism. It's a similar sort of concept with regards to fairness. You don't know exactly what is fair, but you know fair when you see it. It's like, you know what? Yeah, that's kind of fair. Okay, yeah, that's acceptable. We'll go with that.
Or
So,
to go even further in remembering what you said a couple weeks ago, is it's how you feel too. It's more about
bingo.
how you feel, because you
Mm-hmm.
feel when something's unfair rather than knowing
Yes,
or
yes, yes.
seeing.
Yes. And there's all sorts of empirical data that will show fairness, but, you know, numbers don't lie. People do. And if you feel that shit's unfair, you're going to act up the way you want to act up to make sure that fairness is, a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to do what you need to do. Now, there's two other parts involved in this discussion of equality, equity, fairness, inequality, wealth, richness, and it's diversity and inclusion. You're seeing these terminologies thrown out a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
Diversity, it's the traits and characteristics that make us who we are. You are a white woman. I am a black man. I am 6'1". You are about 5'4", 5'5". Okay. You were born in Canada. I was born in England. That you grew up in Alberta. I grew up in Baltimore. That is diversity. It's the stuff that makes us who we are. Inclusion is when we're all together. It's those sorts of behaviors that makes us feel welcome. It's like, I feel a part of this group. I feel like when we go to that PhD program at McGill University, I feel as if I can be myself around all these other people that I've never been a part of, because it's an inclusive situation. It's an inclusive program. It's an inclusive space. There's years ago, I remember taking a leadership class, and actually it was a class on cultural competency in my first master's degree program. And there was a diversity quote by a lady named Verna Myers. And I want to read this quote to you. The quote says, "Diversity is being invited to the party.
Mm-hmm.
Inclusion is being asked to dance."
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. What a good one. Yeah. And I think even further, you already mentioned this, but being asked to dance is the inclusion, but feeling like it's not, there's a sense of belonging and value in
Yes.
that feeling.
Yes.
So,
there is. And in addition to being asked to dance, you also have to like the music you're dancing to.
Mm-hmm.
And that also goes into inclusion. The beat's got to be right. You got to feel what you're dancing to. It's got to be something you want to move to. You don't dance just for the sake of dancing. You dance because you feel it. Mm-hmm. It's exactly like the whole fairness discussion we had a couple of minutes ago. If you feel something's unfair, it's like, come on, I'm going to act up until I feel it's right. Same thing with dancing. And in that sort of concept of dancing, the concept of inclusion, you have to feel like you're a part of something. Mm-hmm. You just can't be a part of something just because, hey, diversity and inclusion, measures and methods say that, we need, based upon proportionality, 1.7 black people. So we're going to put 2 black people into the program just for the hell of it. Okay. That sort of tokenism bullshit doesn't always work. Mm-hmm. You have to feel like you're a part of it. Yeah. Not just be there just to be there.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually really like this analogy because it's making me sort of think of how to explain a lot of how I see the world, because it's if you're invited to the dance, cool, that's awesome. If you're asked to dance, even better, included.
That's a whole different conversation.
And then taking a step back, do you want to dance to this music? That's part of what I am pushing for in this systemic conversation that I bring up all the time. It's
there it is.
Okay, so is the space conducive for everyone to dance? Were you invited, but the dance hall has stairs and you can't make it up the stairs if you are in a wheelchair? There are systems in place in this sort of miniature idea of a dance party that would make it more or less diverse and inclusive, given sort of, and so I like that we can kind of bring that into the broader conversation, because that's where my mind goes all the time.
Absolutely. And plus, me being one of the 7 or 8 greatest DJs of all time, I certainly know what it's like to make people dance. I understand what's at stake here. I know how to work the room. I know how to slice and dice on a pair of turntables. So there's that. But not to get too far away from what we're talking about, this whole idea of being invited to the dance and being asked to dance, it makes total sense, because I remember being a young guy and having a girl ask me, "Would you like to dance, Joe?" Yeah, shit, sure. You feel different about yourself. You feel like, she likes me. I like her. This is all good. Yeah, cool. You know, the music might not be my choice, but you know what? I can deal with that because I'm at least here now. And in years past, comparatively speaking, I wasn't able to get into this space for whatever reason.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One thing at a time too. Like that's the whole thing is like we of dismantling that we keep talking about too. It's like okay,
Mm,
well maybe the music isn't what you like, but you'll still dance and then maybe you can ask the DJ to play something you like more. And that's a little
exactly.
piece of something that, that we can change that is
Hmm.
going to make the atmosphere or the system a little bit better
A
and more
little bit better for
inclusive.
everybody and more inclusive and
Yeah,
more diverse and more
exactly.
diverse and more diverse. So we've covered a whole lot in the first 22 minutes or so of the conversation, but we got to. I know we're going to get to a bit more of the heavier stuff because that's also important. We want to talk about the racial wealth gap. Why did it happen? When did it happen? How did this happen in the United States? And we can point to one exact date with regards to the racial gap between black people and white people. The racial wealth gap began with the first Africans that were trafficked from around the area known as Angola to an area that was now known as Point Pleasant, Virginia, in the United States. And that date specifically is August 20, 1619. August 20th, 1619. Wealth inequality began on that date. Why? Because you had a bunch of white people that were looking for a place, the new world to discover, but there were already people here. Native Americans were already here, and they said, "We need a labor force. We need help. We can't work this land. Let's get some of these black people from Africa, bring them over." And then at that point, the Africans that were trafficked here were not paid for their labor. They were not paid for their labor, and in addition to that, they were treated harshly. We can talk about, there's loads of literature about that, about the harsh treatment of enslaved black people at the hands of white Europeans. There's loads of literature about that. The wealth inequality continued on as a result of the average age of of an enslaved black person during slavery was 27 years old. That was the average age. You had children being forced into labor. You had black people during slavery that were not actually were counted as three-fifths of a human being as a result of the three-fifths compromise. And part of the reason for that was for census purposes and taxation. Okay, so which also furthered the wealth inequality. There were plenty of instances where slaves were freed, but if you wanted to be free, you had to pay for your freedom. You had to pay for your freedom. And this is going to be a slight left turn, but it's worth discussing. July 14th is Bastille Day in France. I'm sure many people might know about the Haitian Revolution and how Haiti and how a former slave named Toussaint Louverture led an army of Haitians to defeat the French Navy. And the French people came back a few years later and said, "Hey, look, all right, fine, you can be free, but you got to pay us for your slavery." So essentially, the French people who enslaved Haitians received reparations from their enslaved people, the Haitians. And that was to the tune of 21 billion with a B dollars. Now, at one point, Haiti was one of the most prosperous islands in the Caribbean. They produced a large majority of the sugar in the Caribbean and, quite honestly, around the world. Now you look at Haiti. It's one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah.
Take a look at France and their colonization of Africa and how many African countries have just recently gained their independence within the past 55 to 60 years. And they use a common currency in many of those Francophone-speaking countries called the Central African franc, which is tied directly to the banks in France. Which means, quite honestly, if French people didn't enslave a whole lot of black people, France would probably be a third world country in the middle of Europe because they get a whole lot of money from a whole lot of other places. Let's contrast that to what's happening in terms of the protests that are taking place in France right now with the Gilets jaunes and the Gilets noirs movements, and how the Gilets noirs are formerly colonized, black people from colonized countries of France that are trying to get rights to work in France. Do you see how this legacy and of this cyclical process of slavery and indentured servitude continues on generation after generation after generation? You had French people enslaving Haitians. Haitians said, nah, fuck that. We're going to fight for our freedom. They get it. France says, nah, we want you pay us for your freedom. Haiti pays up. Now you have a whole bunch of black people in Africa from former French colonies that are like, hey, look, we want to work in France because if you didn't colonize us, we would be just fine. And the French people said no. So just when you think slavery is, I know the conversation is slavery in the United States, but it's also important to make sure that in addition to a localized conversation, there is a global conversation.
Yeah.
Because we're all one world.
Yeah, I really appreciate that too, because it's, it truly is global. And I think that that's why this sort of, the revolution is reaching the global scale right now. And I think
Agreed.
that there's a word that gets thrown around academic places a lot, which is we're living in a post-colonial state right now. And I would disagree.
I thoroughly disagree with that.
Yeah. So yeah, we're definitely still in colonial times. It just looks different, and they've disguised it for us to not pay attention in things like like we're gonna talk about, which is the Jim Crow, the redlining, things like that. And just to bring it back to the States too, like these are things I'm more familiar with. I should look into the global stuff a little bit more though.
It's out there.
Yeah, for sure. I just need to do the research myself. But
and you're busy. You got stuff going on. You working.
For sure. But that's no excuse. And we need to be actively involved in the world around us. So
understood. But not an excuse, but a reason, and a good reason, and a valid reason. And a valid reason. Because we're about fairness here on the Joe and Cat Chats. We're about fairness.
Yeah,
We're about fairness. We're about fairness. And when we continue on with this whole discussion about the racial wealth gap, you talk about slavery, quote unquote, officially ending on December 18, 1865. But again, I continue to go back to this. Just look at one of my favorite props, the United States Constitution. Here we are again. And black people didn't, there it is. And black people, it's getting used because it's getting torn up in the middle. Black people didn't get anything until down here, the 13th Amendment. Guess what? Y'all aren't slaves anymore. But then the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. But you know what? The laws were skewed, so black people really couldn't take part in the political process. Black people back in those days couldn't, if there was a crime committed against black people couldn't call the police. Black people couldn't testify against a white person. But wait a minute, equal protection under the law. So imagine that sort of scenario and apply that to many of the financial situations that were taking place in the United States. And if you committed a crime, you were basically put into prison labor camps where you essentially you were working again, but not getting paid. Now, the 40 acres and a mule situation took place in the beginning of 1865. It was around January 1865, and General William Sherman basically said, "Hey, look, we're gonna let all these black people out of slavery. We're gonna make sure that every black person gets 40 acres and a mule." Because many of these black people who were slaves were really good at farming, and they wanted their own land to farm, to have a sense of self-worth and a sense of dignity and a sense of pride. And quite honestly, to be left the fuck alone by racist white people. You grow your shit, I'll grow mine. You grow your tobacco, I'll grow my tobacco. I'll make my whiskey, You make your whiskey. I'll grow my cotton, you grow your cotton.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happened. Now, part of the reason why they went 40 acres, you're like, why 40 acres? I can explain that. There's Benjamin Franklin created a system of land subdivision called the North American Geographic, it's the North American Land Use System. The North American Land Use System, where he said, okay, you know what? We're going to have these plots of land, and we're going to figure out a way to subdivide them. That way it's easier to plot them on maps, and it's also easier to make sure that we know where they are and we know who owns what plots of land and where. So he said, you know what? We need a standard system of measurement where we can go ahead and just figure out one plot of land. So he said, you know what? This area that's 43,560 square feet, we'll just use that. And then we'll just base everything off that. That 43,560 square feet, that is an acre. Now, if you put 640 acres together, you get a square mile.
Right.
You put 36 square miles together, you get a larger subdivision that's typically seen in Pennsylvania as a township.
Okay.
So what happened is when you plot out 40 acres and over and over and over again, over time you get this nice square plot of land known as a square mile. Mm-hmm. So it's easier to just subdivide everything in 40 because when you go 40, 40, you end up with that. The math works out evenly and you get these reasonably uniform areas of land. You see a lot of these uniform areas of land when you fly over the middle of the country. You see a lot of these crop areas that are perfectly rectangular or perfectly angular. That's based on the North American land use system. And then it's easier to subdivide once you have a right angle or a system of right angles in a larger geographic sense. So that's why they went 40 acres and a mule. So Abraham Lincoln said, you know what? Shit, that's a really good idea. We're going to give all these black folks land. Great. Oops, he gets assassinated. His successor, Andrew Johnson, one of the most racist presidents of all time, was like, you know what? We're not giving you black people all of this land. Hell no. Crazy as shit. We're not doing that for you guys. Back to the fields. And see all these laws that Abe Lincoln tried to get you all for freedom and all of these policies that were going to emancipate you and make you reasonably whole again? Nah, we're repealing all that and we're reversing them. And we're going to make them worse. So that's what happened. Yeah. So when slavery ended officially in 1865, the effects of not being paid for labor and the effects of not having land, because again, as we talked about 35 minutes or so ago, real estate appreciates over time. Real estate appreciates a lot over time. And think about all the minerals and all the natural resources that are under land. Think about all the structures that are built on land. Think about all the oil. But then think about railroads. Mm-hmm. Think about pipelines. Mm-hmm. But think about gold.
Yeah, this is actually a really good moment to bring in the Canadian context because it's similar. Because basically the reason that slavery isn't as well known in Canada is because only about a third of the slaves were actually involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and 2/3 were Indigenous folks. Okay. So it's like a little more hush-hush in Canada. So
Canadians are good at that too. They're kind of hiding their racism.
Oh yeah, we call it smiling racism.
Y'all are good at that.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah, it's an issue.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing is Canadians also like to take pride in that we had an act implemented in 1793 against slavery, which led to the Underground Railroad after the War of 1812.
That's correct.
So these things are sort of the historical things that were basically a posturing of the colonial states to make it seem like slavery was not a thing anymore. But what really happened was the powers that be implemented these systems of oppression, and those just continued
Of course.
in segregating the like geographic locations as to where people were allowed to settle,
Absolutely.
especially after the Underground Railroad.
Hmm.
A lot of folks, Black people that were coming through the Underground Railroad, settled in the southern part of Nova Scotia,
Correct.
and there's lots of evidence that people can look into things were not good. So many of them didn't end up staying there for good reason.
Right. And that
Um,
section of Nova Scotia, I think, was called Africana, if I'm not mistaken.
there was an area called Africville.
Africville, that's it, yes.
Yeah, yeah, and that was a bit later, but yeah,
Okay.
it was set up and then dismantled, I guess,
Mm.
uh, violently. So
As is
yeah,
usually the case.
that's an interesting thing that people should look up to. I don't know that much about it, but yeah, it was a thriving community, and then there were some environmental racism, and basically they went and bulldozed the town.
Mm.
And yeah, it's a really racist history in Africville. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Not
yeah,
surprising. Not surprising. And I guess, and I'm sure there was the legal precedent with regards to going ahead and saying, hey, we're going to bulldoze this black neighborhood. I'm sure there was legal. And with regards to legal policy, legal laws that enforced, and I was going to say racial segregation, but that's deodorized. We're just going to call it what it is. They enforced racism. Yeah, Jim Crow laws.
yeah,
Jim Crow laws, which were right around just shortly thereafter the emancipation. Yeah, Jim Crow laws. And there were loads of, some of the Jim Crow laws were represented through a system of what's called black codes. And you had black codes. Many of the black codes focused on vagrancy laws. So again, if you're a black person and you're just hanging out minding your business, hey, Jethro, what are you doing on the street corner? Well, I'm hanging out. Well, you're a vagrant. You're under arrest. Well, still, black people still didn't have equal protection under the law. So if you committed a crime, back to work. That's what happened.
yeah,
So you had many of these, and then right after that came Reconstruction, which involved many of the southern states defecting to the north, and black people finally getting the benefits of the Constitution. And the Reconstruction period came through with three specific amendments. The 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which said equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which was right here, I'm sorry, ratified in 1870, saying, hey, guess what? Black folks, y'all get the right to vote.
right.
So Reconstruction focused on those three amendments. Now, June 19th, 1865, otherwise known as Juneteenth, is also an important date because that is the date that is celebrated, quite honestly, along the black community of the ending of slavery, the actual abolition of slavery. And this was the day when all the slaves in Texas were freed. But it's also now recognized as a holiday that celebrates the emancipation of slaves, of black people, enslaved black people in the United States. And that is important because, again, that along with Reconstruction, black people were able to start getting land for themselves. Black people were able to find work. Granted, they were not paid as well as their white counterparts, but they were able to have some sort of self-sufficiency because, guess what? Oh, what a novel concept. Black people were actually being counted as people, as human beings. My God. Unbelievable. What a concept.
Yeah,
So
it's amazing.
it really honestly is. So that happened. And over time, black people were able to gain a bit more wealth. Now, the next part of this discussion, when you mentioned about bulldozing black neighborhoods, there was another black neighborhood that was there have been a couple of Black Wall Streets. There is a Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina, which I think was in the 1930s and 1940s or 1830s or 1840s. I can't remember the exact date. But the Black Wall Street that most people know about is in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Mm-hmm.
where there were loads of big businesses, black-owned businesses in black-owned neighborhoods in this particular section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And on Memorial Day, 1921, I think it was a busboy named Dick Rowland allegedly assaulted a lady named Sarah Page. Dick Rowland was black, Sarah Page was white. Dick Rowland was 19 years old, Sarah Page was 17 years old. So Dick Rowland gets arrested. And then they're like, yo, we're going to lynch your black ass. We are lynching you. Black people in Black Wall Street were like, no, we're not going for that. So Second Amendment says, hey, you got a right to bear arms. You can have guns. Doesn't say black people can't have guns. It says, hey, you got a right to bear arms, a well-regulated militia. So black people got guns. White people got guns. The issue is there are more white people than black people. And the white people also got the power of the National Guard and the government with military strength to defeat the black people of Black Wall Street. Mm-hmm. So, to give you an idea of how big of an area Black Wall Street was, Black Wall Street was 35 square blocks. 35 square blocks. You're like, okay, I don't really understand how big of an area that is. You've been to Vancouver before. Mm-hmm. You've been to the Gastown area, right? Mm-hmm. Gastown's nice. All the nice shops, the John Fluvog shoe store there. It's wonderful. Gastown's 12 square blocks.
Okay. Yeah.
So imagine an area almost 3 times the size of Gastown, full of black-owned businesses.
Yeah, that's incredible.
That's Black Wall Street.
I can't even fathom that at this point because it's been...
That's Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
To give you an idea from the other perspective, have you ever been to New York City before?
No, I haven't.
You have not? Okay. I've been to New York City a lot, and I've been to Central Park a bunch. Central Park is 51 square blocks. Mm. It's big. Black Wall Street is about 2/3 the size of Central Park. So 51 square blocks. So it would basically be starting at, let's say, Central Park South, which is 59th Street, and going up to, probably somewhere in the low 100s. Maybe no.
Quite.
Probably in the mid 80s to low 90s. Probably around the MoMA, Metropolitan Art Museum, which is I think 87th or 88th Street.
Okay.
That's about the size of Black Wall Street. And a bunch of really angry white people tore apart that neighborhood. A bunch of black people died. Over 10,000 black people ended up being homeless as a result of Black Wall Street. To this day, not a single dime, penny, or nickel has been paid to anybody who was a descendant of Black Wall Street. Not a single cent. No one's been paid. Plenty of atrocities in the United States that the United States has been involved in, and in other countries where other countries committed atrocities, catastrophes to other people have been paid. The United States has even paid people where they weren't even the perpetrators. The United States paid Holocaust victims and relatives of Holocaust victims. Mm-hmm. And the United States didn't harm any Jews in World War II. That was all the Germans. But the U.S. paid Holocaust victims and their relatives. But black people, enslaved black folk, have gotten zero from the United States government.
If that's not a blatant display of systemic oppression and racism, I don't know what is.
I don't know what is. So we talked about neighborhoods. We talked about Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina. And I love Durham, North Carolina. It's a wonderful town. And we talked about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We talked about that. And I said about a minute and a half ago that there were about 10,000 people who ended up being homeless. The other part we're going to talk about in terms of wealth building and houses and neighborhoods are some of the racist housing policies that prevented black people from access to home ownership. And as we agreed upon, and I think many scholars would agree upon, that home ownership is a great way to build wealth. Real estate is a great way to build wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two federally backed racist housing policies that I think everybody needs to know about. The first racist housing policy is redlining. Redlining. Redlining started in guess what city? Baltimore. Got to start right here in Baltimore. Yes, unfortunately. And happened when real estate agents would go ahead and take a look at a map. They would figure out where there's a predominantly large area of black people on a map, on a real estate map. They would say, hey, you know what? There's a lot of black people in this area here. I'm going to get a red pen. I got a red pen here. I'm trying to be illustrative, but it's not working today. Got a red pen. Got to draw along the map. It's big red area, big circles or big squares. Drawing it up. And you see in these areas, we're not lending any money to black people. We're not letting black people rent properties in these areas. We're not letting black people, here's my red pen. We're not letting black people do anything in these areas. And we're going to defund these areas. We're going to devalue these areas. We're going to make sure that black people in these areas don't get access to loans, government-backed loans. We're going to make sure that black people, we're going to put racial covenants in many of the deeds of these houses. So if you're a white person and you have a house, part of the deed said, yeah, you know what? I can't sell this house to a black person. Oh, I also can't rent it to a black person. So for generations, black people have been locked out through government policy of buying a home, of buying a home. There's a wonderful book that I'm reading right now. We're going to offer up some resources later on. It's this book, The Color of Law.
Oh, yeah.
The Color of Law. And The Color of Law talks about, says right here underneath, our forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Look at that. There's red spots on the map. And this is a residential security map right there. These are the real estate maps that we're talking about. See? Red lining.
Yeah.
So there you have it. Red lining. The other major housing policy that took place that was enforced by the government is called blockbusting. So you'd have a real estate developer that would go to an area where there's a bunch of white people and would say, hey, you know what? Hey, homeowner. Hey, John Q. homeowner. There's a bunch of black people that might want to go ahead and buy up in your area. And because in those days, segregation was obvious, white people didn't want to live around black people. So if you had a real estate agent and a real estate developer telling you, a white person, hey, there's a bunch of black folk that want to come into your neighborhood, those white people were like, shit, no, I don't want that. So the real estate developer would come in and say, hey, well, you know what? You want to be around all these black people? I will go ahead and buy up your house for you. And then I'll pay you. And then you can move somewhere else. Go somewhere else. And then what happened is these real estate developers ended up buying blocks of these homes. But then because of that, they ended up not selling them to black people. And they also didn't resell them to white people. They just owned the homes and then destroyed the block and did whatever they wanted to do with it. Whether they wanted to build a parking garage or regentrify the area for their own purposes or put up a shopping area. Blockbusting. That also was pioneered right here in Baltimore. A bit more history about this. Two of the largest foundations in Baltimore City, one of them is the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation. The other is the Morris Goldsecker Foundation. There's plenty of literature to support that Harry and Jeanette Weinberg, especially Harry Weinberg, was a slumlord and benefited greatly from redlining. And there's plenty of evidence to support that Morris Goldsecker practiced blockbusting. And there's plenty of evidence, literature to support that. Two of the biggest foundations in Baltimore made hundreds of millions of dollars based on these racist housing policies. And now the same people who have nonprofits in Baltimore that want to go ahead and try to improve their social status and try to get something that the government should be providing for them on a neutral basis, you now have to go to nonprofits to get that sort of money. Nonprofits that should have never existed if the federal government wasn't fucking racist and didn't support redlining and blockbusting.
Yeah, and those concepts are still being used in cities today. Many cities are still segregated by neighborhood, and the fallout from those policies is vast. And we've talked about it before. Like the implications of having neighborhoods that are just segregated because of redlining means that no one's going to invest in your neighborhood, which means that you're not going to have food stores to purchase from. You're not going to have good schools to go to. And because the system in the US is based on tax revenue, it goes directly into funding of schools, you're not getting good education. And then you can see how this snowballs into just like this giant system of oppression that has been just years and years and years and years in the making, and now people are sick of it. Yeah, generations in the making. You're right.
Generations in the making. And there are 4 institutions that every vibrant community has. Four institutions that every vibrant community has: school, hospital, bank, grocery store. I'm going to say that again: school, bank, hospital, grocery store. Think about food deserts. It's tough to do that when you don't have a tax base and people nearby. Hospital. Well, why are we building a hospital if there's nobody living here? Or if there's only a few sick people that are living in this area? School. Well, wait a minute. These people over here, there's not a whole lot of people here anyway. We'll just give them a school, but it's going to be a low quality school. And we're going to massively defund it because we don't have a tax base and tax revenue for the people that are living here paying taxes to support the school. Bank. Well, wait a minute. These people don't have money. Why am I going to put a bank in this area anyway?
So if you don't have those fundamental things, then then your life is not going to be going as well.
Your life is devalued.
It's devalued.
Your life gets devalued. That's what happens. Your life gets devalued. And I've seen this far too often in so many cities, not just in the United States, but around the world, but specifically here in Baltimore. Specifically here in Baltimore, because Baltimore started redlining and we started blockbusting. We piloted those programs and we got really good at it. And the effects of those programs are still ever present today. It explains why when you go on the west side of Baltimore, there's not a single grocery store for miles around the west side of Baltimore. And good luck finding a bank. There's one hospital in West Baltimore, and it's the Bon Secours Hospital. And the only reason I know that is because I used to work in the community center 2 blocks away from there. And you're not going to find any groceries around that area. There's 6 elementary schools in that area. 6. Along that area of the west side of Baltimore I'm talking about. There's not a single high school in that area. Wow. Not one. The nearest high school is Douglas High School, Frederick Douglass High School, and it's near Mondawmin Mall, and that's a little bit more northwest. It's not a single high school in that particular area that I'm referring to, about 6 or 7 communities on the west side of Baltimore. So you're not going to have a bank, there's no grocery store, 6 elementary schools, and there's 1 hospital. And that hospital has a questionable reputation. Let's just put it this way. It's not Hopkins or University of Maryland.
Yeah. And this is making me think, like, if there's no high school that's accessible, who's going to want to go to high school then? Like, these systems are built to systemically discourage Black children from making it to high school. That's why the dropout rate is so high.
Also, with regards to redlining and blockbusting, and it kind of plays into your educational aspect of all of this, is the deindustrialization of cities. So you used to be able to go into a high school and learn a trade. Let's learn a trade. I can become a mason, or an electrician, or a plumber, or a barber, which takes more hours of training to become a barber than it does to become a police officer. And I know that because a very good friend of mine in Oakland, California is a barber. And he makes quite a good bit of money cutting hair. You'll be surprised how much barbers make, actually. And he cuts a really nice fade. My point is, you didn't have to go to college back in 1971 if you lived in a city to get a good job and to build wealth and invest in your community. They took away all the trade schools. Took away all the trade schools. Then they said, okay, hey, you know what? Y'all got to go to college. Now, white people and their families have money to invest to send their kids to college. Why? Home ownership. You can mortgage your house, inheritance. Uncle Pete left you 100 grand. I could pay for my college at 100 grand. Shit, especially back in 1975. No problem. Black people didn't have an Uncle Pete that left you 100 grand. Didn't happen. So now, this is why one of the reports that I was just reading, the average in terms of white and black, in terms of the wealth gap, the high school dropout has a higher net wealth than a black college graduate with a master's degree. There's a wonderful report by Sandy Darity and Antonio Moore and a bunch of other people where it talks about what we get wrong with closing the racial wealth gap. It was written a couple of years back, and it's a fascinating report where they talk about how the average white house has $147,000 of net worth. The average black household has $1,800 of net worth. $1,800. Educational achievement isn't necessarily going to be a way to close the racial wealth gap because of everything we just talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And I know we got about 2.5 minutes left.
Yeah.
Or so. Okay. And I know we need to close this out. What are some solutions? Read some books.
Go ahead.
What were you saying? I'm sorry?
I think I froze for a second.
Yeah, you did freeze up. Yeah, you got ice cold for a second, but it's okay. I'm reading this book right now. Okay? It's called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And Dr. Sandy Darity, in the last chapter of this book, has some solutions. I'm going to share some of them with you. He talks about reparations for American descendants of slaves. He talks about reparations to American descendants of slaves through an ARC. ARC is an acronym standing for Acknowledgment, Redress, and Closure. Acknowledgement, redress, and closure. Acknowledgement. Hey, I'm a white person, and I benefited from black people being slaves. Sorry. And I'm going to commit to making this right. Redress. There's 2 ways you can have redress. Restitution and atonement. Restitution is making sure that the survivors get restored to where they were before the situation took place. Atonement is making sure that the people who benefited meet the conditions of forgiveness that are acceptable to the victims. So it's basically white people basically saying, hey, you know what? We're sorry. Can we do this? If we do this, will that make it right? Mm. Quite honestly, there's nothing that white people can say to American descendants of slaves that would say where black people should come back and say, yeah, you know what? Okay, that's cool. We agree to that. No. Atonement's not going to work. So restitution is the way to go. Mm-hmm. Restitution. Third part of ARC is closure. Okay? When a reparations program is put into effect legislatively through Congress, and then there's no more racial inequality. There's no more racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is eliminated. American descendants of slaves will go back to white people and say, hey, you know what? We're good. Everything's cool here. We're going to go on and live our lives happily ever after the end. Those are some of the solutions. So,
yeah, no, that's great.
Couple of resources. This book, From Here to Equality, read it. Another book, Color of Law, read it. Another book by Mehrsa Baradaran is called Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. Read it. Read it twice. It's an excellent book. Dr. Claude Anderson's book, Black Labor, White Wealth. Read it. And we'll put all these in the chat before we shut it down. Or yeah. I'll just put it in the chat
I'll
whenever.
put it in the notes, yeah.
We'll put it in the notes, and I'll send you the notes because I got the notes.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're very welcome. I think that's it for us this week, Kat.
That's amazing. Yeah, we only have 10 seconds left. So I just want to
Okay.
thank you again. My goodness, you are such a wealth of knowledge, and you really are just, it's amazing how much wealth, or how much knowledge of the racial wealth gap that you just imparted on